Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to MADCAST. This is episode 5 of the Spinoza series, and we're going to pick up right where we left off, which is note 2 for the proof for proposition 8. So again, proposition 8 goes every substance is necessarily infinite. We kind of covered that in our last little jaunt through this ancient text here, this Necronomicon. So we're going to move right along to note 2. So in note 2, Spinoza says, and this is a long one, guys, might take up the whole video. We'll see. In note 2, Spinoza says, no doubt, it will be difficult for those who it will be difficult for those who think about things loosely and have not been accustomed to know them by their primary causes. Again, the whole prime mover thing. To comprehend the demonstration of proposition 7, for such persons make no distinction between the modifications of substances and the substances themselves, and are ignorant of the manner in which things are produced. Hence they attribute to substances the beginning which they observe in natural objects. Those who are ignorant of true causes make complete confusion, think that trees might talk just as well as men, that men might be formed from stones as well as from seed. Naughty. And imagine that any form might be changed into any other. So also those who confuse the two natures, divine and human, readily attribute human passions to the deity, especially so long as they do not know how passions originate in the mind. But if people would consider the nature of substances, they would have no doubt about the truth of proposition 7. In fact, this proposition would be a universal axiom, and accounted a truism, for by substance would be understood that which is in itself, and is conceived through itself. That is, something of which the conception requires not the conception of anything else. Whereas modifications exist in something external to themselves, and a conception of them is formed by means of a conception of the thing in which they exist. Therefore we may have true ideas of non-existent modifications, for although they may have no actual existence apart from the conceiving intellect, yet their essence is so involved in something external to themselves that they may, through it, be conceived. Whereas the only truth substances can have, external to the intellect, must consist in their existence, because they are conceived through themselves. Therefore, for a person to say that he has a clear and distinct, that is, a true idea of a substance, but that he is not sure whether such substance exists, would be the same as if he had said that he had a true idea, but was not sure whether or not it was false. A little consideration will make this plain. Or if anyone affirmed that substance is created, it would be the same as saying that a false idea was true. In short, the height of absurdity. It must then be necessarily admitted that the existence of substance, as its essence, is an eternal truth. And we can hence conclude by another process of reasoning that there is but one such substance. I think that this may be profitably done at once. And in order to proceed regularly with this demonstration, we must premise. And then he goes on to offer some premises. So let's talk about that fucking mouthful of a note 2. It's not really a note, it's more of a fucking manifesto. So let's try to pick it apart a little bit here. So we'll do this part by part. So again, note 2. Spinoza says, it will be difficult for those who think about things loosely and have not been accustomed to know them by their primary causes to comprehend the demonstration of proposition 7. Let's go back to proposition 7 here real quick, where he says existence belongs to the nature of substance. So again, he's saying there's a certain set of laws to the universe, aka, or primarily, matter cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be remixed. So that's what he's referring to when he refers to proposition 7, is you can basically boil it down to For the purposes of my interpretation, matter cannot be created or destroyed, is what he's talking about. So he's saying people who don't understand this will have difficulty talking about cause and effect or about primary causes. So if you don't understand that matter can't be created or destroyed, you will fail to understand causality on a fundamental level. And again, this sort of butts up against or implicitly references the whole prime mover argument. And I don't think... I should make a note here, actually. The prime mover argument I don't think was contemporaneous with Spinoza. I don't know if the prime mover thing was around during this time. Whether it was or wasn't, Spinoza's logic, I think, transcends that. I think that it doesn't depend on it. I think his referencing of it, he does so in order to sort of translate a mathematical idea into language or to try to apply a metaphor to a mathematical idea he has. So it doesn't really matter if the prime mover argument came about 200 years later or 400 years later. That's not my point. My point is that his argument here overlaps with it anachronistically, in the same way that it anachronistically overlaps with the whole matter can't be created or destroyed argument. So again, I'm sort of extemporaneously applying these ideas. You know, I'm going back in time in my own head to try to translate this. So again, Proposition 7, existence belongs to the nature of substance. He's saying, if you don't understand this idea, that matter can't be created or destroyed, and that there's a fundamental substrate to the universe, then you're not going to understand my argument about cause and effect, and specifically, not just about cause and effect, but about what he calls primary causes or prime mover type ideas. That there has to be a generative basis for the universe that is the cause of cause in a way. So let's move on. For such persons make no distinction between the modification of substances and the substances themselves. Let's pause here for a sec. That's important. People look at permutations of matter and they think those permutations are representations of the fundamental permutability of matter, but they don't take that idea to its conclusion. They understand, and again, Spinoza's kind of strawmanning here. He does this a lot. A lot of these old authors were like, their worst sins are the prime mover thing and the straw man thing. Like they're stuffing their assholes full of straw. They're wiping their asses with straw. A lot of these guys. It's not just Spinoza. There's 100 of these types of people. It's very hard to avoid straw manning when you're trying to make an argument, because it's very easy to get pissed off at your dumbass audience and be like, well, most of you are just idiots, so I'm just going to attack you in my argument. It's very motivating. You know, it gives you energy as an author to attack your critics, to try to do like a preemptive strike against stupid interpretations of your ideas. And I want to just go back in time and give Spinoza a hug, man, because it's like, I get it, dude, I get it. But anyway, enough about that. What Spinoza is essentially saying here is that if you don't understand the differentiation that he's providing between an immutable, cannot be created or destroyed kind of substrate and its modifications, then you're going to be confused, you know, moving forward in his argument. In a sense, he's warning the reader, you know, if you don't get this, you're going to not get what I'm about to say. So again, what he's established here is, at this point, given the previous points he's made, he's established that a modified substance, or the act of a substance being modified, is not the same thing as the unmodified substance. So you can't look at the potential of a mode of energy or an electron or a gluon or a quark and then compare it to something that it would become or has mutated into or will mutate into. You have to differentiate between the unaffected substrate and its manifestations in linear time, in entropy, whatever you want to call it. Again, apply whatever term you like. Basically, he's saying there's base matter and energy, and then there's how that matter and energy is mutated or transformed or affected by its movement through this reality. So again, the metaphor I used in the last video of the blank hard drive, if you look at a piece of that hard drive or a sector, right? If you've ever had a hard drive that you were analyzing with like check disk or HD tune, and you're looking at that sector and being like, is this a bad sector? Can I write to this and not lose my data? That type of shit. That sector is basically substance, according to Spinoza. Our 2025 brains, that's what he's basically saying. He's saying there's blank hard drive space, and you can divide it up artificially, and even if you can do that, which I guess the hard drive metaphor contradicts the infinity of God or the infinity of substrate, but let's say you have a hard drive with infinite space. Let's say that. That's what Spinoza is essentially saying. What if you had a hard drive that was empty, but it had infinite space, and you could write to it? Or maybe entropy is a manifestation of the limited space of a hard drive. Maybe the space decreases the more data is written to it. That's what we call entropy. Maybe entropy is just a function of more information coming into existence in the universe and taking up hard drive space. Wonder if that's true. In any case, that empty sector of hard drive is fundamentally different from whatever gets written onto it, in the same way that random chaotic energy is different from how it's bound into a physical form or how that energy decays or changes over time. That's what Spinoza is arguing here. So he goes on to say, again, he's talking about people who misinterpret this. He goes, such people will attribute to substances the beginning which they observe in natural objects. So again, he's saying people look at things that have already been mutated or changed, and they attribute that particular form or its particular way of changing to its progenitor substance. So they're using like reverse, would it be deductive reasoning or reductive reasoning? I can't remember. I always confuse those terms. In any case, what they're doing is they're looking at an existing thing that's been affected and is still being affected by time or change or entropy, and they're saying, well, the qualities of this thing that's sort of already been corrupted by change or by entropy, then that corruptibility must apply to its progenitor state or the thing that birthed it or the substrate that it came from. That's a fallacious thing. I agree with that. Spinoza goes on to say, those who are ignorant of true causes make complete confusions. They think that trees might talk just as well as men. So here's my man, Spinoza, using a metaphor that Tolkien probably would disagree with because he loved writing about talking trees. That's the contrarian in me. I love being like, well, actually, Tolkien wrote about talking trees. Basically, you get what he's saying. It's observing a speaking human like me right now as a certain type of manifestation of matter that's able to communicate. And then from that evidence, you know, the person that Spinoza is strawmanning as like an idiot who doesn't understand him would look at a human or whatever and go, well, if a human can talk and it's made of matter, then why can't a rock or a tree talk? Duh! That's basically what he's saying. Again, it's an obvious straw man. It's kind of a low-hanging fruit kind of argument. Respect to Spinoza for even trying to talk about any of this, but it's kind of a shitty argument. You know, he's posting his L's in this book from 100 years ago that was a translation of his ideas from 400 years ago. Not trying to dab on the guy. Love his ideas. I wouldn't be talking about them if they weren't interesting. To me, anyway. So let's move on. After this little metaphor, he says, those who confuse the two natures, divine and human. Now here's an interesting thing. This is the first point where he's actually talking about substance and its affectedness, or its affect or effects. And he's explicitly replacing those two terms with divine and human. So this is where his argument is kind of coming through in his own language without him explicitly talking about it. He's actually switched to, instead of substance and affected substance, he's talking about divinity and humanity. So this is where religion and mathematics in his own language are starting to sort of fuse with each other semantically, which I think is interesting. I think he maybe did this intentionally. And again, this translation's old. My translation's bullshit, so you've got an old translation plus a bullshit one. Maybe two wrongs make a right. I hope they do. But in any case, Spinoza first refers to sort of this distinction here between divinity and humanity, and he's equating it with the distinction between infinitely potential, chaotic, substrate goop or empty hard drive type of stuff, or a type of space that's like that, versus the finite, mutable, decayable, mortal forms that occupy that space. So he's making that distinction here, and he's using the terms human and divine here for the first time in this argument. So again, he says, those who confuse the two natures, divine and human, readily attribute human passions to the deity, especially so long as they do not know how passions originate in the mind. So again, he's talking about the ancient Greeks here. I feel like he's making like a jab at the ancient Greeks who are like, well, the gods raped each other and they were human too and they had human passions. And it's like, I mean, you know, I could go on a million tangents about ancient Greek gods and how they're actually Nephilim or giants, but that's a whole other thing. That's a thing for Charles Carroll to do. I'll leave that to him. What I'm trying to say is that this argument, again, is sort of moving from the purely logical or the purely mathematical into the metaphoric or the Jungian or the narrative-based, archetypal-based language. So Spinoza is essentially straddling these two realms of thought in this text. He's trying to equate logical and mathematical ideas with the sort of narrative logic of archetypes and of, you know, divine versus human, heaven versus earth, that sort of thing, which is an admirable thing. He does it very subtly here. If this translation is worth its salt, even this one, you know, as rough as it is, as old as it is, it's preserving Spinoza's attempt to do that. So again, he's talking about passions, right? You can't attribute mortal passions or ideas to God. This is why I'm a deist and not a Christian or a Buddhist or a Muslim or an epic Zoroastrian or an epic Gnostic or whatever. I'm not any of those things because I don't think human beings can project human interpretations onto God. I think we can understand on some level that God exists. And that's all that really matters to me. If you can understand in yourself that there is something that we've called God, that it does exist, that's all you need to understand, man. You know, if you're a piece of shit in your life and you have poor morals, you're going to get punished by other people. God doesn't have to punish you. If you're shitheel, other people will punish you. But you do, I think, if you have half a brain, you're going to come to this conclusion somehow. And I think that anything beyond deism is pretty hard to make a logical argument for, because you end up in subjective human-based interpretations of the divine. You end up in a quagmire of this huge spectrum of humans projecting their own emotions, their own behavioral impulses, their own ideas of what God would be if he were human, that type of shit. Miss me with that. I can't agree with it. I will never agree with it. I will die disagreeing with it. It's not true. It's wrong. It's fundamentally wrong. Humans cannot apply human characteristics to God. We can figure out that he exists, and that, if anything, is the divine gift, is just being able to know that God exists. Is that not enough? Do people have to invent Zeus giving birth to daughters out of his abdomen and all sorts of weird fetish shit? Come on. We got the internet. We got enough fetish shit floating around. We don't have to have it in our religions. Just make everybody a deist. Just convince everybody, just read Spinoza instead of the Bible. That's why I'm reading it right now. Anyway, basically that's what Spinoza's saying, is human passions being applied to God is retarded. And then he goes on to say, if people would consider the nature of substance, they would have no doubt about the truth of Proposition 7. Again, existence belongs to the nature of substance, or substance gives rise to existence, or the two are intertwined in some way. In fact, this proposition would be a universal axiom. Hell yeah, man, that's what I just fucking said. Spinoza, you stole my rant. I just ranted about that. I just said everybody on Earth should be a deist. And I'm not saying that in some kind of creepy globalist way like, let's abolish all religion and people shouldn't be able to interpret God on their own terms. I'm saying the opposite. I think everybody has to interpret God on their own terms, but that proves my point, that God can be interpreted on multiple terms. Why is that? Because God isn't dependent on human interpretation. Duh! If God was dependent on a specific group of people's interpretation of God's nature, then every other group that didn't interpret him that way would be gone. They wouldn't exist. Why would God allow them to even be here? Maybe that's too easy. My point is just, the whole argument that, like, being a deist is too universalizing, or it sort of diminishes specific individual cultures' interpretations of God, that's not what I'm arguing here. What I'm arguing is God is capable of being interpreted in so many ways because his only fundamental quality is that he just exists. And that's what Spinoza is arguing here. God just is. You can misinterpret or interpret or reinterpret God in whatever way you like, but he still exists. He exists despite disparate interpretations of his nature. So if you really want to interpret God in the most pure way, in my opinion, at this point in my life, reading this, you just have to say, well, God just exists. He just is. That's pretty low effort, you know? You don't have to rely on some creepy book that some priest wrote 1,000 years ago, or some heretic schizo rambled about and got his YouTube followers, or the equivalent, to retweet or repost. You don't have to deal with any of that. Just believe that there's God. There's something. There is God. That's pretty low effort. That's pretty minimal. God's being pretty fucking generous, I think. In any case, that's what Spinoza's arguing here. He's arguing that human interpretations of God are flawed because human brains are flawed, because we are slaves to our passions. It is hubristic at best for us to try to define or characterize God as being, jealous or wrathful, or God felt kind of shitty on a Tuesday, so he decided to kill a billion people. Like, come the fuck on. That's a human thing. It's not a godly thing. God wants us to sacrifice a lamb to him. No, that's the creepy king that told you God spoke through him to get you to kill a lamb so he could have some mutton for his dinner. I mean, come on, man. You don't have to be an atheist Redditor idiot to criticize human interpretations of God. How the fuck could a human interpret God? That's why I love Spinoza, man. He points this out, but he does it so elegantly. He does it with logic. He doesn't rely on Reddit tier bullshit. He just goes straight to the point. So let's stop ranting and rambling. Let's try to move on here. So Spinoza talks about how this should be a universal axiom, what I just argued. And then he goes on to say, modifications exist in something external to themselves, and a conception of them is formed by means of a conception of the thing in which they exist. Modifications exist in something external to themselves. So he's talking about essentially universal forces or laws or the laws of physics. So how a thing is modified is not determined by the thing being modified. I agree with that. Like a rock tumbling down a mountainside and then it falls into a river and then 10 million years later it gets pitched into a volcano. The rock did not control its own destiny. Again, there's a sort of deterministic logic to this. And that's what Spinoza is saying. Is he's saying that a substance does not control its own destiny, or an assemblage of matter, like me, doesn't control its destiny. I was supposed to make this YouTube video. I was compelled to do it by God, according to Spinoza. Ooh, spooky. Basically, that's what he's arguing. And he's saying stupid people will deny this. Because in his time, apparently, people were very resistant to his ideas. Again, he got kicked out of his rabbi-mediated community for being too much of a truth bomb dropper. Anyway, let's move on. Spinoza moves on by saying, therefore, we may have true ideas of non-existent modifications. For although they may have no actual existence apart from the conceiving intellect, yet their essence is so involved in something external to themselves that they may through it be conceived. Okay, so what he's saying is you could imagine how matter could be affected by chance, time, entropy, and just because you've imagined that something could be affected that way, that imagined scenario, even though it only exists in your mind, is not free from being true. And he's using this thought experiment or this little exercise to prove his previous point, which is that matter or objects are dependent upon effects that apply to them externally or from outside of themselves. So again, a rock doesn't control its destiny any more than a human does. It's very deterministic. This is very determinism. Determinism is basically just, it's hard for me to summarize it. It's basically like fate exists. You know, you're fated to do X, Y, or Z. Even if you resist it, you were fated to resist it. It's that type of shit. Spinoza is arguing in that sphere. His argument depends upon that kind of conception of temporal progression of matter, of reality. Depends upon that. So he's basically saying, here's another way of proving that. If you have an idea of how something could be changed or affected, even in your fantasy, in your mind, that fantasy depends upon an object being unable to control its destiny relative to what's affecting it. So even if you fantasize about a fictional scenario, you know, the rock tumbling down the mountain that I talked about earlier, maybe it gets picked up by a squirrel and carried higher up the mountain. That's a fictional scenario I just came up with in my mind. Even in that scenario, the rock doesn't determine its movement through time. It's dependent upon external forces, or laws of nature, laws of physics, whatever you'd like to call them. That's what Spinoza is arguing here. And it holds water. This guy's solid, man. He's a real one. These arguments are choice. So let's keep going here. Whereas the only truth substances can have, external to the intellect, must consist in their existence, because they are conceived through themselves. So again, he's saying that substrate of reality, you can't think up something that precedes you or your ability to think or imagine. So we humans have come up with an idea of God, of something that has to exist just because it has to exist. You can argue that's a logic loop. You can argue that we're fantasizing, that we're coping. Those are arguments that don't involve themselves with Spinoza's stuff, but they are arguments. I may talk about them at some point later on, but I'm probably not going to talk about them for a while. In any case, we're talking about what Spinoza's talking about, which is this idea that humans humans can conceive of substances that just have to exist for reality to exist. So there has to be some substrate, some constitutive empty hard drive or whatever it is, right? And the only truth substances can have, as Spinoza puts it, external to the intellect, must consist in their existence. So he's saying even things we haven't imagined had to exist before our ability to imagine them, or even before our existence. This is kind of a, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's here to hear it, it's kind of like that. But it makes sense. It's like, well, we are here now. I'm here talking to you. For me to be here, I couldn't pre-exist before I exist now. I couldn't have existed before I do now and created myself, right? Spinoza's saying there has to have been something that didn't even need to be imagined. So this is really cool. This goes back to his prior argument about relationality. Remember, he was talking about finite versus infinite things. And infinite is a term I've kind of used very loosely throughout these videos. But bear with me. His argument here is very important. It's why this argument convinced me to go from being an agnostic to a deist. You know, it sort of pushed me just outside of hell. I was like, all right, okay, I get it. The key thing about this part of point 2 is that Spinoza says there are things external to the intellect that just have to exist. They just have to. Because the intellect couldn't have existed if they didn't precede it. So there has to have been something that existed before we did. That's the bluntest way to put it, right? Before anything existed, there has to have been something. And again, this kind of overlaps with the prime mover argument, but I think it puts it in a way that's it's explained more effectively. Let's read it one more time. The only truth substances can have external to the intellect must consist in their existence, because they are conceived through themselves. So when we look at matter around us, right, if I look at this glass of grape juice, I'm conceiving that it exists. I'm looking at an assemblage of matter through my senses, and I'm saying this is a glass of grape juice. But that glass had to exist prior to my apprehension of it, or else I couldn't have conceived of an apprehension of it. I couldn't have even interpreted it, if it didn't exist to be interpreted. I'm not manifesting the glass psychically out of my mind, out of nothing, right? There's a thing that I'm looking at. This could be a glass of cyanide, or it could be a lizard, or a diamond. I could be interpreting it wrong, but there has to be something for me to interpret in the first place, whether my interpretation's incorrect or correct. That's what Spinoza is saying, is he's saying substance has to exist prior to its interpretation, or to its interpolation, or to its mutation, to entropy, to time being applied to it. Substance exists prior to its attribution by the forces of reality. Brilliant argument. I fucking love this guy, man. Let's move on here. Therefore, for a person to say that he has a clear and distinct, that is, a true idea of a substance, but that he is not sure whether such substance exists, would be the same as if he said that he had a true idea but was not sure whether or not it was false. Again, what did I just say? There has to be something in my hand right now. This is very existential. This is where Spinoza gets... This motherfucker's getting existential, yo. He's broaching that existential shit. He's smoking the existential weed. He's smoking Black Biden Double Dragon weed, aight? This is some existential shit. Damn. And he's not even talking about existentialism here. That's what I love about it, is he sort of just uses existentialism for his own argument, which isn't even about that. It's about the idea of substance and its modifications, and it's about the existence of God. It's existentialist, but it's more specific than that. Existentialism's a broad field. Again, I'm speaking anachronistically. Existentialism didn't exist when he was writing this. That's why he was ahead of his time. He's a fucking mad genius, this guy. But again, he's saying it's absurd to say that you understand substance but don't acknowledge that there has to have been, or still is, a fundamental substrate that finite things arise from, aka there's a God that makes non-godly things. He's saying if you understand that things exist in the first place, you have to acknowledge that there's a source of those things. And again, this sounds like the prime mover argument, but it's not. It's deeper than that. Spinoza, I think, either he dodges or circumvents that argument, or he enhances it. He provides a much better version of it than any version I've heard. So let's keep going here. It must then necessarily be admitted that the existence of substance as its essence, so again, things that exist because they have to, is an eternal truth. And we can hence conclude by another process of reasoning that there is but one such substance. So again, God is this uniform substrate, this bed of chaos, this empty hard drive. I think that this may profitably be done at once. And in order to proceed regularly with the demonstration, we must premise. So here's where we can move on. So he has these premises here. 1. The true definition of a thing neither involves nor expresses anything beyond the nature of the thing defined. That makes sense. Things are distinct. Even God is distinct from things that aren't God. Even though he doesn't need to be compared to them, he can be compared to them. That's the trick. And then, of course, you have blades of grass and all the shit that I talked about in my other videos. Premise 2. No definition implies or expresses a certain number of individuals. inasmuch as it expresses nothing beyond the nature of the thing defined. For instance, the definition of a triangle expresses nothing beyond the actual nature of a triangle. What example did I use before, guys? It does not imply any fixed number of triangles. So let's read that again. Again, this is all put very old-fashionedly. So again, premise 2. No definition implies or expresses a certain number of individuals. Okay, so he's not talking about people. I think more broadly he's not talking about individual objects, which he's already established. Again, he overclarifies at times. Inasmuch as it expresses nothing beyond the nature of the thing defined. Right, so again, one finite, mortal, non-godly construct or thing or object cannot perfectly define another object next to it. That's kind of relativistic. Again, the whole tree falls in a forest thing, the wine glass thing, grape juice glass. I think that holds true. That makes sense. And then Spinoza goes on to say, for instance, the definition of a triangle expresses nothing beyond the actual nature of a triangle. Okay, yeah. So, so what he's saying is, any defined object, any individualized, comparison-based, singular, entropy-bound, mortal, decayable, immutable, mutable thing, anything that is subject to time, that is separate from God, that is going through time and decaying according to the laws of physics, it is only able to express its own nature on its own, and then it changes not because it wants to change from within itself, but because external forces force it, no pun intended, to change. So again, the rock tumbling down the mountainside. The rock, or the human, with a mind of his own and a will and free will and freedom, whatever it is, right? The squirrel, the whale, the human, the rock, whatever, the tree, they might want to do or be something, but that will is confined to their own individual being. And the only thing that really changes their trajectory or their path is how external forces act upon them. So again, this is a very bleak... Spinoza would not agree with the concept of willpower or of choice. In Spinoza's universe, determinism is king. There's no choice. I'm kind of inclined to agree with him. Did I choose to be here making this video right now? I don't know. Maybe I did. You know, Spinoza's not God, but he makes some good points. Again, that's what he's saying here. He's saying that anything that's separate from God, aka an individual, mutable mote or chunk or construct of matter, does not determine its own changeability or how it changes. It can only express its own form forever. And it's always doing that. Like the rock that tumbles down the mountain, it wants to still be that same rock forever. The anxious person who wants to be comfortable in their life forever and have nothing around them change, Spinoza's like, yeah, that's normal. Stasis is the desire of every piece of substance that's been removed from God or separated from the divine. And the only way that those things change is through the application of external forces to them. So again, the triangle just wants to stay a triangle until something fucks with it and makes it into a square or dents one of its sides, fucks up its perfect symmetry. That's the whole point that he's trying to make. And, guys, there's a third premise here. There's a lot of premises here. Let's go to premise 3, shall we? Premise 3, Spinoza says, there is necessarily for each individual existent thing a cause why it should exist. Well, of course. If there wasn't a cause, it wouldn't exist. Again, I feel like Spinoza's argued that. I don't want to spend time on that. Let's keep going. Premise number 4. This cause of existence must either be contained in the nature and definition of the thing defined, or must be postulated apart from such definition. Ooh, that's a little bit vague. Oh God, his explanation of that is a whole page. Guys, we're gonna leave things at premise 4, which I'll remind you is like a sub point of note 2 of the proof for proposition 8. So we have proposition 8, the proof for proposition 8, note 1 for proposition 8, note 2 for proposition 8, and then note 2 of proposition 8 has 4 premises. So that's used up my whole hand. I love this guy, man. If he'd been born nowadays, he'd be making Sonichu medallions. Thank fuck he was born 400 years ago and was able to write this. But screw the rabbis that excommunicated him. I hope you're all boiling in pots of shit in hell for that. 'Cause this guy was a real one. And you should have listened to him. Okay? Anyway, guys, that's the end of the 5th Spinoza video. Thank you again for watching. We're going to keep soldiering on through this series. I really do want to finish this. Eventually I'm going to conglomerate all this into one big fat video. Yeah. Hope you're doing well in your life. Stay happy. Stay healthy. Those two things are intertwined. And don't take life too seriously, but also don't look at life as a game or a joke. That belittles the value of it, and it will drain your soul to systematize life too much. You can't do that. Keep a part of your mind open to childlike joys, and there's a great phrase from a short story I love, which is embalmed innocence. Keep a part of yourself, of your childhood self, embalmed if you can't keep it alive. Not a creepy part, but if it's your sense of humor, that's the best one in my opinion, is keep your sense of humor intact, because it will allow you to move through life without losing your soul. So, on that cheery note, thanks again for watching, and as always guys, peace out.